Racist officer insults black lawyer, then realizes he's defending his case, ***. Jason Monroe, a distinguished black lawyer known for his resilience and tenacity, prepared himself as he entered the courtroom. He was used to battling prejudice, but today, fate had thrown a twist he could not have anticipated. He had been assigned to defend Officer Blake Turner, a police officer notorious for his racially charged behavior and, as irony would have it, the very man who had insulted him just days prior. Jason's reputation preceded him. People murmured as he passed, exchanging glances and whispers. He knew he was being watched, not only because of his successful track record but also because of the unique dynamics of this case. Turner sat at the defense table, smirking, flanked by two other officers who shared his disdainful expression. Jason could feel their eyes on him, appraising him with barely concealed contempt. The first interaction between Jason and Turner was tense. "They actually sent you to defend me?" Turner sneered, his voice thick with disdain. His tone made it clear he was both unimpressed and insulted. Jason took a deep breath, reminding himself of his duty. He knew this case would be challenging, not just legally but morally. Jason's commitment to justice would be tested in ways he had never imagined. Turner's words stung, bringing back memories of the discrimination Jason had faced throughout his career. He had worked tirelessly to overcome stereotypes and had proven himself time and again. But sitting here, across from a man who looked at him with pure contempt, he could feel the old wounds reopen. Turner's arrogance and open disdain reminded him of the uphill battles he had fought since he entered law school. As the judge entered and called the courtroom to order, Jason focused on the task at hand. He knew that he couldn't let Turner's attitude derail him. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind, "Justice isn't about who you like, it's about what's right." Jason had heard those words countless times growing up, and they grounded him now. This case was about the law, not personal feelings. Throughout the day, Turner made snide remarks, muttering under his breath every time Jason spoke. His comments were venomous, intended to belittle and undermine Jason's confidence. But Jason held firm, ignoring the insults and focusing on the evidence before him. He reminded himself that he was here for the truth, regardless of who his client was or how he felt about him. The irony of the situation hung heavy in the air. Here he was, a black lawyer defending a white officer with a history of racist behavior. Jason could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the unspoken question lingering in the minds of everyone present. Why would he defend someone like Turner? But Jason's commitment to his principles outweighed the discomfort of the situation. He had a duty to uphold justice, even when it was difficult. As the proceedings continued, the prosecution presented damning evidence against Turner. Bodycam footage showed him using excessive force against a young black man during a traffic stop, a routine incident that had escalated unnecessarily. The footage was difficult to watch, but Jason knew he had to separate his personal feelings from his professional obligations. He was here to provide a fair defense, no matter how grim the evidence looked. Turner's demeanor remained defiant, his face set in a smug expression as if he believed he was above reproach. Jason watched him, noting the lack of remorse. It was clear Turner felt justified in his actions, his sense of superiority blinding him to the consequences he faced. Jason felt a surge of frustration but quickly tamped it down, reminding himself of his role. During a recess, Turner leaned toward Jason, his voice low but filled with hostility. "I don't know why you're even trying," he said, his lips curling in a sneer. "You're wasting your time. I don't want or need your help." Jason met his gaze, his expression unreadable. He chose not to respond, letting the silence speak for itself. He knew he couldn't change Turner's mindset, but he could still do his job. Jason's silence unsettled Turner, and for a brief moment, Jason saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by the familiar arrogance. Turner's pride wouldn't allow him to acknowledge his vulnerability, even as the evidence against him piled up. Jason knew that this case would push both of them to their limits, each forced to confront uncomfortable truths. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom grew. The prosecution continued to lay out a compelling case, and Jason knew he had his work cut out for him. But he also knew that he couldn't let his personal feelings cloud his judgment. He was here to uphold the law, even if it meant defending someone who despised him. When the day's proceedings finally ended, Jason gathered his notes, preparing for the challenges that lay ahead. He felt drained, the weight of the case pressing down on him. But he was determined to see it through. He would give Turner the defense he deserved, even if Turner didn't appreciate it. This case was about more than personal animosity, it was about integrity. As he walked out of the courtroom, Jason couldn't help but feel the irony of the situation settle over him once more. He was defending a man who would never show him the same respect, a man who saw him as nothing more than a stepping stone in his quest for absolution. But Jason knew that his duty was to justice, not to the individual. Jason steeled himself, knowing that the journey ahead would be filled with obstacles. This case would test his resolve, his patience, and his commitment to the principles he held dear. But he was ready. No matter how difficult the road became, he would remain steadfast, holding his head high in the face of adversity. This was his path, and he was determined to walk it with dignity. As the following day began, Jason walked into the courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose. Despite Turner's scorn and the challenges before him, he was prepared to give this case his all. He'd spent the night reviewing evidence, crafting his arguments, and mentally preparing for the grueling process that lay ahead. For Jason, this wasn't just about defending a client, it was a test of his resilience and professionalism. Turner, however, remained as arrogant as ever. Sitting at the defense table, he wore an expression of impatience and annoyance. He barely acknowledged Jason's presence, keeping his gaze fixed ahead as if to emphasize his disdain. Jason was accustomed to facing adversity, but Turner's constant, open hostility added a layer of tension he hadn't expected. The prosecution continued its assault, presenting a compelling case against Turner. They showcased video footage, witness testimonies, and even brought in the young man who had been at the receiving end of Turner's aggression. The victim, a college student named Andre, took the stand with a quiet dignity that contrasted starkly with Turner's arrogance. He spoke of the fear he'd felt during the encounter, his voice steady but laced with pain. Jason watched Turner's reaction carefully, hoping to see a hint of remorse, but Turner's face remained impassive. His jaw was set, his eyes cold, and his posture defiant. Jason couldn't help but wonder what had hardened Turner so deeply. There was no trace of humanity in his gaze, no sign that he recognized the suffering he had caused. It was as if Turner believed himself untouchable. During a brief recess, Turner leaned over to Jason, his voice dripping with disdain. "I still don't see the point of all this. That kid had it coming. If he hadn't acted suspicious, none of this would have happened." Jason felt a flash of anger but kept his expression neutral. He understood Turner's mindset, even if he found it repugnant. Turner saw himself as the enforcer, above reproach, immune to the rules that bound everyone else. "Whether you see it or not, the evidence is there," Jason replied, his voice calm but firm. "This is your chance to take accountability, to show that you understand the consequences of your actions." But Turner only scoffed, dismissing Jason's words with a wave of his hand. Jason sighed inwardly, realizing that any attempt to reason with Turner would be futile. The courtroom reconvened, and Jason began his cross-examination of the witnesses. Despite his personal feelings, he presented his defense with meticulous care, challenging each point with skill and precision. He knew that a strong defense was essential, not only for Turner's case but for his own integrity as a lawyer. The judge watched him closely, and Jason could sense the weight of every gaze in the room. As Jason worked through his arguments, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. People began to see the complexity of the case, the layers of truth and prejudice that intertwined to create this situation. Turner's actions had been reprehensible, but Jason's defense highlighted the systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked. It was a sobering reminder that this case was part of a larger problem, one that extended far beyond the courtroom. For the first time, Turner seemed to realize the seriousness of his situation. As Jason dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece, Turner's smug demeanor began to waver. His arrogance gave way to a flicker of fear, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Jason didn't relish Turner's discomfort, but he couldn't ignore the small satisfaction he felt at seeing the officer's confidence finally shaken. After the court adjourned for the day, Turner pulled Jason aside, his tone different from before. "You're actually trying to win this, aren't you?" he asked, a hint of confusion in his voice. Jason looked at him, feeling a mix of pity and frustration. "That's my job," he replied simply. "Regardless of who you are or what you've done, my duty is to defend you to the best of my ability." Turner looked away, his expression unreadable. Jason wondered if his words had finally pierced Turner's armor, if he had planted a seed of doubt in the officer's mind. It was a small victory, But Jason knew that change was a slow and arduous process. Still, he hoped that, in time, Turner might begin to see the world through a different lens. As Jason left the courthouse, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. This case was more challenging than any he had faced, not because of the evidence but because of the man he was defending. Turner represented everything Jason had fought against his entire life, yet here he was, standing by his side in the name of justice. That night, as he reviewed his notes and prepared for the next day's proceedings, Jason reflected on the irony of his situation. He was defending a man who despised him, a man who had caused pain to others without a second thought. Yet, he couldn't help but feel that this case was exactly where he needed to be. It was a reminder of his purpose, his commitment to the ideals of fairness and justice. Jason knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles and moments of doubt. But he was ready to face them. This case was more than a test of his skills as a lawyer. It was a test of his resolve, his ability to stand firm in the face of hatred and adversity. And as he closed his notes and prepared for bed, he knew that, no matter the outcome, he would see it through to the end. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation the next morning. The tension between Jason and Turner had become almost palpable, and the case was gaining public attention. Reporters lined the hallways, their cameras flashing as Jason entered, capturing his every move. He ignored them, focusing solely on his task. Today, he would continue his cross-examination and, with any luck, make strides in turning the tide of this case. As Jason took his seat, he glanced over at Turner, who was uncharacteristically quiet. The smirk was gone, replaced by a tense, focused expression. Jason wondered if the gravity of the situation had finally sunk in, if Turner was beginning to grasp the reality of the evidence against him. But Turner's gaze remained cold, his pride seemingly still intact, though cracks were beginning to show. The prosecution called their next witness, a young woman who had been present at the scene of Turner's arrest. She described the incident in vivid detail, painting a picture of a man who had let his power get the best of him. Her voice was steady, but Jason could hear the tremor of fear beneath it. She was visibly shaken, glancing nervously at Turner as she recounted her experience. The jury listened intently, some of them exchanging glances, their expressions grim. When it was Jason's turn to cross-examine, he approached the witness carefully. He knew that the jury was sympathetic to her, and he had to tread lightly. With calm precision, he asked questions that subtly highlighted potential inconsistencies in her testimony, planting seeds of doubt without attacking her credibility directly. It was a delicate balance, but Jason was a master of his craft, and he navigated it skillfully. As he returned to his seat, he felt a slight sense of accomplishment. He had managed to weaken the prosecution's case, even if only by a small margin. Turner's gaze flicked over to him, and for the first time, there was no sneer, no condescension. Instead, there was a look of grudging respect, as if Turner was beginning to understand the lengths Jason was going to defend him. During the lunch recess, Turner pulled Jason aside, his tone hesitant. "Why are you doing this? You know who I am. You know what I've done." His voice was lower, almost vulnerable, as if he were struggling to understand Jason's motivations. Jason met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm doing this because I believe in justice," he replied. "Everyone deserves a fair defense, even you." Turner looked away, clearly unsettled by Jason's words. Jason could see the conflict in his eyes, a flicker of something human breaking through his hardened exterior. It was a small moment, but it gave Jason hope. Perhaps, beneath the layers of prejudice and pride, there was a part of Turner that could change, that could recognize the harm he had caused. As the afternoon session resumed, the prosecution presented more damning evidence, each piece adding to the mountain of accusations against Turner. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and Jason felt the strain of defending a man who seemed so unrepentant. But he pressed on, determined to fulfill his duty, even as the odds stacked higher against them. Jason's closing arguments were a masterclass in legal defense. He acknowledged the flaws in Turner's actions without fully condemning him, emphasizing the need for due process and a fair trial. His words were measured, compelling, and the courtroom hung on every sentence. The judge observed him closely, his expression unreadable, but Jason could sense the respect in his gaze. As he returned to his seat, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had done everything in his power to give Turner a fair defense, regardless of the outcome. He glanced over at Turner, who was watching him with an intensity Jason hadn't seen before. There was no arrogance left in his gaze, no sneer or disdain. Instead, Turner looked almost thoughtful. The court adjourned for the day, and as they left, Turner approached Jason once more. His expression was conflicted, as if he were wrestling with something he couldn't quite put into words. "I don't get it," he muttered. "Why would you fight this hard for someone like me?" Jason met his gaze, his voice steady. "Because that's what justice is. It's not about who deserves it. It's about making sure everyone is treated fairly." Turner looked away, a shadow of remorse crossing his face. Jason knew that the road to redemption was long, and he didn't expect Turner to change overnight. But perhaps, just perhaps, this experience would plant a seed of doubt in his heart, a question that would linger long after the trial ended. As Jason walked away, he felt a strange sense of peace. This case was not about winning or losing, it was about doing what was right. And in that moment, he knew he had fulfilled his duty, not only as a lawyer but as a man who believed in the power of justice. The path ahead would be difficult, but he was prepared to walk it, step by step, with unwavering resolve. The next morning, Jason arrived at the courthouse with a sense of finality in the air. Today, the jury would deliberate. The case had been grueling, both legally and emotionally. Jason had done everything within his power to present a strong defense, even though Turner had shown him nothing but contempt from the start. Yet, despite Turner's actions and the overwhelming evidence against him, Jason had remained steadfast in his commitment to justice. He knew that whether or not Turner appreciated it, Jason had done his job. Turner was already seated when Jason walked into the courtroom. His face was pale, and for the first time since the trial began, there was a noticeable tension in his body language. He no longer carried the smug confidence that had marked his behavior throughout the trial. Instead, he looked uncertain, even nervous. Jason took his seat beside him, and for a moment, the two exchanged a silent glance. "I did my best," Jason said quietly, breaking the silence between them. Turner shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said enough. There was no longer any hostility in his gaze, no simmering anger. It was as if the weight of everything had finally come crashing down on him. Jason could see it, the fear of what was to come. As the jury filed in, the courtroom went still. All eyes were on them, waiting for the moment of truth. Jason felt his heart pound in his chest, though his expression remained composed. This was the culmination of days of hard work, late nights, and an internal battle between his professional obligation and his personal feelings. No matter what the verdict would be, Jason knew he had upheld his principles. The judge called for order as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as he read the decision. Turner sat rigidly, his eyes fixed on the foreman, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Jason could feel the tension rolling off of him, and he braced himself for what was about to come. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Blake Turner, guilty of excessive use of force and misconduct," the foreman announced, his voice clear and firm. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the weight of the verdict sank in. Jason felt a pang of both relief and heaviness in his chest. Turner had been found guilty, and while it was a just outcome, it was hard to celebrate the downfall of any man. Turner's face went pale, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he looked completely lost, as if the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. Jason watched as Turner absorbed the verdict, his expression shifting from disbelief to fear, and finally, resignation. The reality of his actions had finally caught up to him, and there was no escaping the consequences now. As the judge began to discuss sentencing, Turner leaned over to Jason, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't think it would end like this," he muttered, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and regret. Jason glanced at him, his expression calm but firm. "This was always a possibility," Jason replied. "But now you have a chance to reflect on what brought you here." Turner stared at the floor, his hands shaking slightly. Jason could see that the arrogance had drained out of him completely. The officer who had once dismissed him with contempt was now grappling with the reality of his actions. Jason felt a complicated mix of emotions. He had defended Turner despite everything, but now that the truth had come to light, there was nothing left to hide behind. The judge concluded his remarks, setting a date for Turner's sentencing. The courtroom began to empty, reporters rushing out to relay the news to the world. Turner remained seated, staring straight ahead, his face blank. Jason packed up his notes, preparing to leave, But as he stood, Turner spoke again. "Why did you fight so hard for me?" Turner's voice was quiet, almost defeated. There was no malice in it this time, no hint of the disdain that had colored his every word before. He looked up at Jason, his eyes filled with confusion, as if he couldn't understand why someone like Jason would go to such lengths to defend him. Jason paused, considering his answer carefully. "Because it's not about who you are," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It's about the law. Everyone deserves a defense, no matter their actions or beliefs. That's what justice is about. Fairness, even when it's hard." Turner seemed to wrestle with the concept, his brow furrowed as he processed Jason's words. Jason could see the struggle playing out in his mind, the clash between the prejudices he had clung to for so long and the reality of the situation he now faced. There was no easy answer for Turner, no simple path to redemption, but perhaps this experience had forced him to confront the truth about himself. As Jason walked out of the courtroom, he felt the cool air hit his face, a strange sense of relief washing over him. The trial was over, but the impact of the case would linger for a long time. This case had pushed him to his limits, tested his patience, and made him confront the harsh realities of prejudice and justice. But in the end, Jason knew he had done what was right. The reporters swarmed him as he exited the courthouse, their questions flying at him from every direction. Jason answered them briefly, his focus already shifting to the future. He had more cases to work on, more clients to defend. But this one would stay with him. It was more than just a legal battle, it was a battle for something greater. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Days after the trial, Jason found himself replaying every moment in his mind. Despite all his training, the case had affected him deeply. It wasn't the verdict that weighed on him but the man behind it. He had come face to face with someone who represented everything he had fought against, yet he'd given that man the same level of defense he would have given any other client. This case reminded him of why he became a lawyer, to fight for justice, even when it felt impossible. Meanwhile, Turner awaited his sentencing. His once proud image had been shattered, and news of his conviction spread quickly through the community. People who once respected him turned away, even some former colleagues distanced themselves. Jason heard through the grapevine that Turner was struggling, alone and forced to confront his actions in isolation. For the first time, he was dealing with the consequences of his choices, and it was clear that the reality was hitting him hard. One afternoon, Jason received an unexpected call from the prison where Turner was being held. A guard informed him that Turner had requested to see him. Surprised, Jason debated whether to go. He had fulfilled his obligation as Turner's lawyer. He owed him nothing more. But curiosity, and a desire for closure, drove him to agree to the visit. He wanted to see if Turner had truly changed, or if this was just another attempt at manipulation. Arriving at the prison, Jason felt a sense of apprehension. He was led through a series of locked doors and into a small visitation room where Turner sat on the other side of a thick glass partition. He looked different. His once confident posture was slouched, his face pale and drawn. The weight of guilt and shame was evident, and Jason couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy, despite everything. As Jason picked up the phone on his side of the glass, Turner mirrored the action, his eyes tired and hollow. "Thank you for coming," Turner said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a stark contrast to the arrogant man Jason had known in the courtroom. Turner's pride seemed to have been stripped away, leaving a man who looked almost broken. "I didn't expect to hear from you," Jason replied, his tone cautious but curious. Turner hesitated, looking down as if struggling to find the right words. Finally, he spoke, his voice filled with a sincerity Jason hadn't heard before. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About justice, about fairness. I guess I never really understood what those words meant until now." Jason listened, surprised by Turner's admission. He had never expected the officer to reflect on his actions, much less admit to having misunderstood the concepts of justice and fairness. Turner continued, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. "I grew up believing certain things I never questioned. And I hurt people because of it. People who never deserved it." Turner's voice cracked, and he looked away, as if ashamed to meet Jason's eyes. "I can't change what I've done," he said, his words heavy with regret. "But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Not just to you, but to everyone I hurt." He swallowed, struggling to keep his composure. "I don't expect forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. but I needed to say it out loud. Jason was taken aback by Turner's confession. This was a man who had once been unrepentant, dismissive of the pain he'd caused. Yet here he was, grappling with remorse, acknowledging the harm he had done. It was a small step, but it was genuine, and Jason respected him for it. "It takes courage to admit that," Jason replied, his tone softening. "What matters is what you do with this realization going forward." Turner nodded, a faint glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "I know. I don't know where to start, but I want to try." For the first time, Jason saw a hint of humanity in Turner, a glimpse of the man he might have been if his life had taken a different path. It was bittersweet, knowing that it had taken a conviction for Turner to confront his beliefs, but it was a step toward something better. They spoke for a while longer, discussing the future and the possibility of redemption. Jason made it clear that while forgiveness might be hard to come by, accountability and growth were within Turner's reach. It would take time, humility, and a willingness to confront the darkest parts of himself, but Jason believed that Turner was ready to try. As the visit ended, Turner thanked Jason once more, his voice filled with a sense of quiet gratitude. "I'll never forget what you did for me, even though I didn't deserve it," he said. Jason nodded, feeling a sense of closure. He had given Turner a fair defense, upheld his duty as a lawyer, and perhaps, just maybe, helped him take the first step toward change. Walking out of the prison, Jason felt a sense of peace. He had gone beyond the call of duty, providing not only a defense but a lesson in compassion and justice. This case had tested him, challenged his values, and reminded him of the importance of fairness, even in the face of prejudice. He had done his part, and now the rest was up to Turner. Weeks passed, and Turner's sentencing day arrived. Jason hadn't intended to attend, but a sense of duty, perhaps even curiosity, compelled him to witness the final chapter of this turbulent journey. The courtroom was packed, tension filling the air as people waited to see how justice would ultimately be served. Reporters lined the aisles, their cameras ready, capturing every moment of the scene. When Turner was escorted into the courtroom, Jason noticed the transformation in him. He seemed a shadow of the man he had been when they first met. His usual defiance had faded, replaced by a resigned humility. He kept his gaze lowered, showing none of the arrogance that had once defined him. Jason felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness as he observed Turner. This case had taken a toll on both of them, forcing them to confront painful truths. The judge entered, and silence fell over the room. He reviewed the facts, recounting Turner's actions and the impact they had on his victims and the community. His voice was measured, but there was a hint of reproach in his tone as he delivered a scathing reminder of the damage Turner had caused through his abuse of power. The court listened intently, each word a reminder of the reason they were all here. Turner's attorney made a brief statement, emphasizing the remorse Turner had shown in recent weeks and asking the court for leniency. Jason watched Turner closely, searching for any sign of insincerity, but he found none. Turner looked genuinely humbled, and Jason couldn't deny that the experience had changed him in profound ways. But Jason also knew that remorse alone could not erase the harm Turner had caused. When it was Turner's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his voice shaky but resolute. I know that nothing I say can undo the pain I've caused," he began, glancing briefly at Jason. "But I want to acknowledge the damage I've done. I want to apologize to those I hurt, those I failed to protect because of my own blindness and prejudice. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm ready to accept whatever punishment the court deems fair." His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Jason felt a surge of respect for the man standing before him, a man who had finally come to understand the weight of his actions. The courtroom was silent, everyone taken aback by the unexpected vulnerability in Turner's statement. For the first time, he had taken full responsibility, facing his wrongdoing without excuses or denial. The judge deliberated for a few moments before delivering the sentence. Turner would serve time in prison and be required to participate in community programs aimed at understanding and addressing racial prejudice. It was a fair sentence, reflecting both the seriousness of his crime and his willingness to change. Jason felt a sense of closure, knowing that justice had been served, not only through punishment but through growth and accountability. As the court emptied, Jason stayed behind, watching as Turner was escorted out of the room. Turner met his gaze one last time, nodding silently in a gesture of gratitude and understanding. Jason returned the nod, feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason, even if it had been a painful journey. They were two men from different worlds, brought together by a twist of fate that had changed them both. Outside the courthouse, Jason was approached by reporters eager for a statement. He spoke briefly, emphasizing the importance of justice and accountability, but his thoughts were already turning inward. This case had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, pushing him to the limits of his professionalism and his personal beliefs. Yet, in the end, he had emerged with a renewed sense of purpose. As Jason walked away, he reflected on the lessons he had learned. This case had shown him the power of redemption, even for those who seemed beyond it. It had reminded him of the importance of standing firm in his principles, of treating every client with fairness, no matter who they were. He knew that the journey ahead would bring new challenges, but he was ready, strengthened by the experience. In the days that followed, Jason received a letter from Turner. It was brief, but its sincerity was undeniable. Turner thanked him for his defense, for showing him the path to accountability, and for being a force of integrity and justice in his life. Turner promised to use his time in prison to reflect, to learn, and to change, knowing that it was his only chance at redemption. Jason kept the letter in his desk, a reminder of a case that had tested every fiber of his being. It was a symbol of the power of justice, not only to punish but to heal, to transform. And as he looked to the future, Jason knew he would carry this experience with him, a guiding light in his journey as a lawyer, and as a man who believed in the unyielding strength of integrity and compassion. Thank you for watching till the end. This story reminds us of two key lessons. First, justice must be impartial. Jason defended Turner not because of personal feelings, but because fairness should always prevail. We should strive to treat everyone with integrity, regardless of who they are. Second, change is possible even for those who seem beyond redemption. Turner's journey shows that when one faces the truth and seeks accountability, a path toward growth and understanding can emerge. Let these lessons inspire us to uphold fairness and believe in the power of transformation.